Now, I'm very excited to present our next keynote speaker. Saul Griffith is an engineer and entrepreneur specialising in clean and renewable energy technologies. He's founded a dozen technology companies across 20 years in Silicon Valley. He's also written 3 books, including Electrify and The Big Switch. He's recently turned his attention to policy work and writing, including founding Rewiring America and Rewiring Australia, non-partisan organisations dedicated to electrification and decarbonisation and associated policy and regulatory impacts in terms of meeting our climate goals. Saul will make his presentation, though we have eaten into a fair bit of his time, so there'll probably only be time for a couple of questions, but please do welcome Saul Griffiths.
Thank you. I have an evil stepmother. She married into the family, so she allows us to call her that. She's actually quite lovely. And she's doing a book tour this week in America for her new book called Recoding America. She worked in the Obama administration as the deputy CTO. She started the Digital Government Service in the US, trying to digitize government. And since the Obama administration, she's been working in local government through an organization called Code for America, trying to make governing more efficient. So she's actually should be here today speaking instead of me, because she's an expert in how policy gets converted to local government action. And her big concern was made very clear to me. She happened to be visiting the country when I had a meeting with Wollongong City Council to talk about electrification of Wollongong and what it will mean for the citizens and what do we do. And so the other technical guy that came with me, we do our 30-minute highly technical talk, much of which I'm about to show you. And we thought we did great, but we could see that the sort of concerned looks on all of these council members' faces. And when we left the meeting, Jen said to me, "You just exploded everyone's head. They think in terms of work plans. You didn't say anything in the language that they speak." And so with that precursor, I know that I might explode your heads and not really know how to speak your language, but I'm hoping to talk to you about what we need to do really to address the last issue, which is climate, which is my big concern. So what are our solutions for climate? And as you just learnt, the perfect lead-in topic was cyclones, floods, and fires. You've probably, if you monitor the climate news, it's all fairly bad. The Arctic will now no longer have summer sea ice. We know that's set in stone. All of the environmental and climate indicators are worse than the scientists predicted, which is unfortunate. And it calls into question our urgency. So this is from a new book from a friend of mine, Jonathan Coomey, Solving Climate Change. It's great. And he talks explicitly with this graph to the idea of net zero 2050. That was the climate target in 2018. So 50% emission reductions by 2030, net zero 2050, that'll give you roughly a 1.5 to 2 degree target. The problem is, that was if we did, I'm trying to do the laser beam thing. There you go. That was only true if we stayed on that blue path. The problem is that we kept increasing emissions from 2018 through to now. And so really now you'd need something like 75% emissions by 2030 and actual zero 2040 if you want to go close to 1.5 degrees. You'll still overshoot 1.5 degrees and you'll need to do reduction. So it is only always going to be a climate emergency requiring rapid transformation forevermore, because we're still going to miss some targets. So this is to really underscore how quickly we have to move. Much of that is discussed in these 2 books. Electrify was a love letter to Joe Biden. The Big Switch is a love letter to the Australian people saying we actually can go faster and further than America on climate for reasons that I'll explain as we go along. The book Electrify really came from this. I'm going to test you all on this graph at the end of the conversation. This is the US energy system. On the far left, there's all the inputs: oil, coal, gas, nuclear, solar, wind. On the far right are all the end uses. So I can tell you absurd things like 0.2% of US energy is used in abattoirs. 0.9% of US energy use is using natural gas to pump natural gas through 1.3 million miles of pipeline. There's a whole bunch of other anecdotes in there. That became the origin of the book Electrify, and it was that knowledge of the US energy system that made me start Rewiring America with a couple of colleagues. That was a pretty exciting adventure. I thought we were just going to be an advocacy organization leading into the 2020 presidential election. As soon as this guy got elected, we were invited to help Chuck Schumer's office write the Inflation Reduction Act. So this was the 1.5 second fist bump I got with Joe Biden. This is our team that worked really, really hard on the Inflation Reduction Act, which is poorly named because it's the largest climate bill in human history. Part of the reason it's called the Inflation Reduction Act is because you can make a chart like this. I have made this chart for America. This is the Australian version. But this is to say that the good news is electrification and climate solutions are now actually anti-inflationary. So I'm going to explain this for a second. This black line is the total cost of energy for an Australian household from 1990 through to 2020. And that's the cost of your petrol, your natural gas, your electricity, any bottled gas or LPG you use, all of your energy uses. It's up now, and this is the cost of living crisis with inflation and COVID, supply chains. It's about $6,000 to $7,000 per year per Australian household for all their energy use. If I could wave a magic wand, it's a microphone, not a wand, and electrify everything in an Australian household, their cost of energy the day after you've electrified their 1.8 vehicles, you've electrified their cooking, you've electrified their water heater, you've electrified their space heating. If you do half of that electricity comes from the grid, half of that electricity comes from solar on your house, that would be your cost of energy going forward. And it doesn't increase with inflation as fossil fuels do because you're financing this thing. When you buy solar cells, you're buying 20 years of energy up front, and you pay a fixed price for 20 years, which is basically the repayments. It's the same. The same will be true of the cars. So this is a really good news story and can be used as the economic argument for Australia really pushing hard on electrification because it actually is the principal mechanism by which we will decarbonise. It's also the way we could save every Australian household $3,000 to $4,000 a year on their cost of living and energy bills. This is the other graph I'm going to test you on at the end. This is the Inflation Reduction Act, $369 billion broken down by all the pieces of it. As you can see, it should have nearly all been called the Electrify Everything Act. It was nearly all spending on electrification, except for a little bit on land use. And about half of it was for the supply of clean energy, so wind, solar, even nuclear. And the other half was for demand-side solutions. Demand-side solutions means where you use energy. It was the far right of that graph I showed you earlier. It's in your cars, it's in your households, it's in your small businesses, etc. So the US government is actually going to, we launched this calculator the same day the Inflation Reduction Act was announced. And the US government, on average, will give $14,500 of incentives to every American household to electrify and decarbonise. If every American household takes full advantage of it, this is actually, for my household in San Francisco, I qualify for $33,000 in incentives. If every household in America takes full advantage of all of the tax concessions and other incentives, they will actually deploy $1 trillion of capital. Think about that. That's an extraordinary amount of money. It was explicitly designed to permanently change the marketplace for energy in the US to clean electrification, so that all the cars will become electric, all the homes will be all electric, etc. So that's the tailwind that we're now chasing. As wonderful as the Inflation Reduction Act was, it will only do about half of the emission reductions required for a 1.5 to 2 degree target. So there needs to be additional legislation of even greater ambition in the US. So that brings me to Rewiring Australia. This is Australia's emissions. Below the dotted line, these are the emissions that we export that don't go on our tab, they go on other countries. So that's our natural gas being burnt elsewhere, our coal making steel somewhere else, etc. Above the dotted line are the emissions that count on us. And I've broken that into domestic economy emissions. So that's things we do in our homes, that's things we do in our communities, things we do in small businesses on top, and then into trade emissions. So these are emissions that come from us exporting things. So this fuel combustion is diesel digging up coal, digging up iron ore, and taking that to port. The electricity use here is using dirty electricity to make our manufactured products for export. Really, it's operating mines and metal processing facilities. What I'm trying to say is the majority of emissions that we can control are these emissions in our households, in our commercial building stock, and these are things that we can decarbonise now. We don't yet have technologies to replace these exports. We don't yet have technologies to decarbonise agriculture, and we don't have green steel, for example. So in terms of those 50 to 75% emission reductions that we need to do this decade, the only real option we have is to do it in our households, in our communities, in our small businesses. So that's to say fast and early emission reductions are vital. I'm now going to give you a fairly depressing set of slides to tell you what the task is. So let's try to hit 1.5 degrees. You really need to get your community to zero emissions by 2030. 42% of emissions in Australian domestic economy are decisions that people make around their kitchen table. Fuels in their car, what heats their home, where the electricity comes from. Another 29% of our emissions come from decisions made in small businesses. So what type of car does your small business own? How are you heating your small businesses? So it's actually the majority of our domestic emissions are these millions of decisions made by everyday Australians. Now, they're all decisions about machines, and we've already mentioned them. Things like your cars, your space heater, your kitchen, your water heater. These are the average lifetimes. The average water heater lasts about 10 years, kitchen stove about 12, space heaters 15, cars 20. These curves would be the reduction in fossil fuel-powered versions of these machines if you never bought a fossil-fueled car, water heater, or space heater again. Because it takes 10 years to go through the building stock of water heaters, if we stopped selling natural gas water heaters today, it would be 10 years before you've got all-electric fleet. So this literally says that you have to go, you can never really install a fossil fuel appliance or a vehicle in Australia ever again if you want to stay on target for 1.5 degrees. So that sounds hard, but if you think about it as a household, this was a nice expression. Someone came to me, they said, this is our personal household carbon dioxide plan. Get solar now. As you know, solar in Australia is famously cheap. It already works economically. They were going to use the savings. They projected about $1,000 a year savings from the solar. 2 years of those savings, they were then going to electrify the stove and the water heater. Wait for 2024 to get a battery. This was in 2022. He told me this, predicting that the prices will drop, and then get an electric car in 2025. I was wondering why the car was coming last, and it's because he's waiting, this particular person, for the VW bus. But this is to repudiate reduce, reuse, recycle as the mantra for how do we be good climate citizens. And it's really to say that you make roughly 6 decisions in your life. You make those decisions once a decade, and they are the infrastructure of your life. And if you make those 6 decisions well, you have 0 emissions, which is a lot easier to think about than trying to make in the aisle 1,000 cereal boxes, which one is the best for climate. That we're incapacitated by those decisions as opposed to understanding the great majority of our emissions are these simple decisions. So I really think we need to figure out very quickly how to support 11 million Australian households to go on this journey of electrification. It might start with an electric car, might start with a solar, might start with a bike. Every household will do it differently. And if you do it perfectly, that's roughly what you need for a 1.5 degree climate, which is what we should want given the context of the previous speakers. So that's all about electrifying the demand side machines, the cars, the appliances, solar on the roof, batteries. We also obviously have to supply clean electricity to those from wind, solar and hydroelectricity. Here's the other thing. So efficiency has been emphasised by the environmental movement since the 1970s, because the first big energy crisis after the modern environmental movement started was a supply-side energy crisis in the US of missing their foreign oil. The answer to that at the time, policy-wise, was to have fuel economy standards for cars to make them 15% more efficient, fuel economy standards for water heaters to make them more efficient. That gave us Energy Star appliances and fuel efficiency standards. But you can't efficiency your way to zero emissions. You have to electrify. So the efficiency we've always been looking for is actually electrification. So let me go through that. About 80% of the energy that goes into the petrol truck on your left is wasted as waste heat on the engine block and out the tailpipe. The electric car will use about 1/4 to 1/3 of the energy per kilometre of a petrol car. The same is true if you use a heat pump to heat your homes. That's a bad drawing of a natural gas furnace and a heat pump, but the heat pump will use 1/3 of the energy or 1/4 of the energy of the natural gas to do the same amount of heating. The same is true of the water heater if you go to a heat pump, and the same is especially true of our grid. The current grid running off coal and natural gas, 75% roughly of the energy that goes into those generators is lost as waste heat. If we produce our electricity with solar and wind, we don't need that waste. This is how that translates to a household. Australian household today on average uses 102 kilowatt hours per day of energy. The great majority is vehicle fuels here. If you electrify that magical, mythical Australian household completely today, same sized home, same size cars, we don't even make the housing stock more efficient. You just keep our leaky homes. It'll be about 37 kilowatt hours per day. So the energy use goes down by more than half just by the process of electrification and powering it through renewables. And curiously, the electricity use will go up 280%. So this also emphasises that we need to triple the amount of electricity that we're generating with the renewables. Not just clean the existing grid, but triple the size of it. That's necessary to get to zero emissions. It turns out that underlying efficiency and the extraordinarily low cost of rooftop solar in Australia, it was actually in the US, this is to give you all of yourselves should give yourselves a pat on the back. In the US, rooftop solar costs about, in Australian terms, $4 to $4.50 per watt installed. And it's because local governments have jurisdiction over what you're allowed to put on your roof, and they have very onerous permitting inspection processes that take 3 months. In Australia, you can get the permit in 1 day, and the cost of rooftop solar is under $1 a watt. So that means Australian rooftop solar is the cheapest energy of any source ever to be delivered to a retail consumer. So here it is again. Again, this is 2019 data when Australians used to spend only $5,000 a year on energy. They now spend about $7,000, like I said. It's $3,000 to $4,000 on petrol and diesel. It's about $2,000 a year on electricity and $1,000 a year on gas. And here is what could happen to Australia if we electrify everything. So 2021, $5,000 a household, 2022, $7,000 a household. You might be asking, what is this grey bar? So that would be the cost if you went and borrowed the money from a bank to buy 1.8 electric cars, electric water heater, electric space heater. As you know, the electric cars are a little bit more expensive than the petrol cars right now. And the cost of financing would be high and more than you're currently paying in energy. But the cost of these, and you'll be noticing it, you'll see the Hyundai outside, and the cost of the electric cars is falling very, very dramatically. The cost of all of the solutions are. And in fact, by 2024 or 2025, the cost to an Australian household will be cheaper to be all electric than to run on fossil fuels. This is now inevitable. The stimulus for the Inflation Reduction Act is changing all of the world's supply chains, so it will actually probably make this graph happen even sooner. If you're an energy-intensive household, think a household with 3 teenagers and 3 cars, you would already be saving money electrically. Driving 1 kilometre in an electric car from Australian rooftop solar will cost you 1 to 2 cents per kilometre. Driving the same size car on petrol or diesel is about 20 cents per kilometre. That's where a huge amount of the savings are coming from. You can build an argument, we're trying to build this argument with the federal government, that if the federal government had stimulus that looked like the Inflation Reduction Act, in the idea of pushing incentives to electrify, you could overcome that upfront cost for the next couple of years with about a $12 billion investment that would actually lock in $30 or $40 billion a year in savings for the Australian public. When I do these same numbers for America, so you saw for Australia, it's economic to electrify in 2024 or 2025. That won't be true until about 2028 in America and 2030 in Europe. So we literally get to go first. We get to go first because you did a good job and you got us cheap rooftop solar. And Australia can afford to do this type of policy making if we can commit $389 billion for some submarines over 20 years. Surely, thank you. Surely we could find, $12 to $20 billion to help Australian households save money, right? A much more existential threat. This is my slide to say you're important. And I still don't know exactly just how important, but building codes count, zoning counts. If you think about it, there's 100 million machines in Australia that need to be electrified. They'll need to have chargers and solar. They'll have some software that manages it. There'll be retailers, a distribution network, community generation and storage, and this is the substation. So all of this happens under local government. So helping the permitting for all of these things, this is not even to mention the vehicle charging that needs to be prolific in every community to make this work. It really comes under local government. The federal government can provide money, but the implementation, that was where my joke about my evil stepmother was coming from in the beginning. Federal government can provide money, but the actual implementation of this is going to be on you guys. This is to say we've made some mistakes in Australia. Cost of electricity fell for 40 years straight, little blip in the 1980s, and then we decided to let the privatisation and the market competitive reforms happen in Australia. That's when the NEM started, and the price of electricity has skyrocketed since. This is to say we made a mistake in Australia in the way we tried to restructure the electricity market. That mistake is continuing to being made. Our regulatory authorities, Australian Energy Regulator, AEMO, AEC, ESB, are still trying to design the energy system for the future as though it's made of point source gas power plants and coal power plants. We need to rewrite the rules of the electricity market and the electricity grid to favour the household and the community. Why is that? This is the average price of Australian electricity, 27.5 cents, the bar on the left. You can see about 9 cents of it is for the distribution, that's the local poles and wires, 2 cents for the transmission, that's the big wires across the landscape that farmers complain about. This is the generation price down here. Compare that to rooftop solar after financing, 4 cents a kilowatt hour, stored in a battery, so you're running your house half off the battery, half off the solar, 15 cents a kilowatt hour, still cheaper than the grid. And then I put another column over here to emphasize something I want to emphasize with this community of you guys today. Solar that you make in your community, if you could treat it with rules of the electricity grid the way that household rooftop solar gets treated, so your solar cells on your roof, I'm your neighbour, you're not home, I use it to charge my vehicle, you're home later with your vehicle, I use your vehicle to cook my, with vehicle to grid battery to cook my dinner. But if we can enable those local energy transactions, because they shouldn't really stretch the grid, to just have a small cost, then you would motivate the maximum deployment of solar within your community and community energy. Now, the reason you would like to maximize the rooftop solar, maximize the community solar, you will still need grid connection, and I'll come to that, but is to minimize the total cost of energy to the Australian household. This is a terrible graph, and I shouldn't have put it here, and I really recognize that. But I threw it in this morning because we're doing analysis on, to go back, what could this energy be? So this chart, and I've done it for, you can see where I live, Wollongong, but everyone else doesn't get a special treatment. But this is car parks. This is if you just took registered car parks in Australia and covered them with solar, imagine solar over the car parking spaces, that's 42 terawatt hours per year of electricity. This is the amount of electricity to make an average Australian car drive 15,000 kilometres in a year. So in fact, our car parks could generate enough electricity to power 16 million Australian cars, basically the entire domestic fleet. So this should motivate you to think about, okay, in my local government area, not only should I figure out how to help households electrify and maximise their solar, but how do we utilise all of the other community assets? I sort of did this mapping exercise for where I live in Ostermere, North Wollongong. This is the rail corridor. You could put solar over the rail corridor. There's schools outlined here. There's Sydney water facilities outlined here. There's a lot of car parking spaces and commercial buildings. But you could generate 1/3 of the energy for our community off these already being utilised pieces of public infrastructure, but you just make them also produce solar energy. Okay, I wanted to tee those up because I want to tell you what success could look like for an Australian community. So this is where I live, Ostermere. It's slightly above average on the income level, but otherwise we're very typical, 1.9 cars per dwelling, 2.7 people per house. This is almost an exactly average suburb by those metrics. We're in 2515 again, very, very similar. 11,000 people live there, 4,000 households. We are serviced by an electricity substation. Most of you are mayors, so you probably know where this is. You've hidden it down in the industrial estate somewhere in your city. That provides all of the electricity for our local community. If we electrified every household in 2515, you would increase by about 250% our energy use, and you'd need that 6 to 8 megawatts of power all year round. With 100% rooftop solar penetration, we would be able to have more than enough energy for all household and commercial activities in 2515 for all months of the year except for June and July, even with only 50 or 75% penetration of rooftop solar. And there are some of you are mayors in South Australia where you already have communities with 50% penetration of rooftop solar. You approach being able to do enough energy for your community. So most Australian communities, you will be surprised, could produce the majority of their energy internally. This won't be true of the very crowded capital cities, but anything that has population density that looks like Brisbane, Perth, Hobart, Western Sydney can produce the majority of their own energy. Why is that important? So back to the household economics again. Average household in my community spends $3,500 a year at the local petrol station. That money leaves the community as on a one-way ticket, right? So it creates one job that's also selling tobacco and sugar. So 3 things that can kill you in one shop. Finally got a laugh. 2 laughs, going for my personal best. They spend about $300 on natural gas. Again, doesn't create very many jobs in our community at all. We buy a little coal-based electricity, which does create a few jobs in our community, but largely this money does not do a lot of work in our community. If we fast forward to 2030, where we're all electric, the average household would be saving $4,000 a year. You'd be keeping that $3,000 that was leaving in the community. So it would result in about $5,600 a year in community spending, because not only are the households saving money that they'd be spending in their community, they'd also be paying for the electricians and the local tradespeople, because you can't really outsource these jobs of electrifying homes to China. It's work that has to be done in your local community. That story is great for the household. It's even better for the community. So for our postcode of 2515, we spend $15 million a year on oil, petrol and diesel, another $4 million a year on the grid. If in 2030 we are still spending the same amount to get the same amount of electricity to the grid, but we produce the other 2/3 of our energy locally with rooftop solar, community solar, we'd create 25 new local jobs in labour for keeping and maintaining all of that stock. We'd be saving $21 million a year in the community. Roughly 55% of Australian household spending is spent in the local LGA. So 55% of that $21 million would very likely be being spent in the local community. So think about what happens to a community if year after year, $12 million that you weren't previously investing and spending in your community was going into your community. So it's an extraordinary opportunity for economic renewal for Australian communities. So I'll finish there. This is the household infrastructure plan that we need to get the whole country onto if we are really serious about our climate targets, especially if we're serious about doing them on schedule. Just to underscore that from the beginning, we really need to be looking at zero by 2040. The current government's 43% commitment by 2030 is under-ambitious to that goal. 26% of that 43% they inherited from the previous government as dubious tree growing schemes that have since been found to not produce as much carbon abatement as we thought. So this is to really emphasise that we have to do this in our communities in Australia very, very quickly if we are going to hit our climate targets. So thanks very much.
I was just going to say we've got time for maybe one question. Sorry, I feel terrible.
I'm sorry.
Okay, maybe two. I think you've been waiting there, and then we'll have to break for lunch. But yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Saul. Amanda Finley, Mayor of Shoalhaven, just down the road from you at Wollongong. So yesterday, this convention voted down a motion from Shoalhaven that sought to put in place some reduced emissions from cars to really drive the electric vehicle market. Today, we have a motion in front of us from Gunnedah Council, which wants us to bring in the nuclear question into our future thinking. So you've stated this morning that we can do this all on solar, but why I think that motion was voted down yesterday is that some people think that heavy transport in Australia is just an impossible child. Can you make some comments, please, on heavy transport?
The great majority of heavy transport in Australia is moving fossil fuels around. I'm not joking. 50% of international shipping is moving fossil fuels around. 3% of American energy supply is using oil to make petrol. So a huge amount of our emissions disappeared just by electrifying these things. Electric trucks will absolutely do the job. They're coming. The batteries are getting twice as good. The electric pickup trucks are already here. They're just only in America. They're not here. Norway, which is, in a population density sense, not that dissimilar to Australia, had 80% electric vehicle sales this year. So it can be done. It can be legislated. Norwegians are really enjoying that and improved health outcomes as well as improved economic outcomes. So it's a shame that your first commitment was knocked down. I'm not anti-nuclear. If you are having a serious conversation about climate change in Europe or Southeast Asia, you have to have nuclear on the table because the population density is so high you can't do it with wind and solar. In Australia, we can easily do it with wind and solar. I caution you that it took 40 years to get the last nuclear power plant in America commissioned and running. So they've built one of their 103 nuclear reactors in the last 40 years. If you anticipate any country being able to get up to speed with nuclear installations on a climate-relevant timeline, you're naive. Yeah. Oh, another question, number 2.
Some of us wouldn't mind missing 5 minutes of lunch to get a question or two in.
I can do as many as you can tolerate.
I personally have asked Linda Scott for every year I've been a councillor at Bega Valley to invite you, so it is wonderful to have you here. And driving from my paradise or Tathra Beach area, where you are warmly welcome anytime this year. I was listening to Alan Finkel talking about the need for us to have gas in the grid for another 2 decades, I think, and I just wondered what your or our comment can be other than try and pin him down to one of your addresses.
There will be gas in the grid until you've built sufficient wind and solar to displace the gas, and that realistically is 10 or 15 years, but there's no reason you can't go faster. I would disagree with Alan on his position on gas, and I would disagree with his position on hydrogen, and I think you should read his latest book in contrast to what he did when he was actually the chief scientist for Australia, which was give very bad climate and energy policy advice.
You can take another one.
Number 4, please.
Oh, sorry, up here.
Thank you. Philippa Veach, Randwick City Council. Look, our council is getting most of its operational power through 100% solar, along with 25 other councils. We're giving subsidies to residents, but the biggest obstacle we are finding is trying to deliver cheap, renewable, preferably on-site energy to people who rent, who live in apartments. I'm on LG New South Wales. I'm a delegate to our local, regional group of councils, and at every step, trying to find a way forward on this. I've just been told it's not possible at this stage. So that would be something that would be a game changer for our community, to be able to get cheap renewable energy for people who rent and live in flats. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that this question is extraordinary and extraordinarily important, and it's typically, to a public audience, the first question asked is, well, what about me? I'm a renter, and we don't have good answers. Some things can only be solved through policy and regulation. We provide extraordinary incentives and tax breaks to landlords in Australia. And honestly, what the Inflation Reduction Act was a successful hack on the American tax code. And it was very, very wonky, like hand-to-hand combat tax code policy writing. We need to do the same thing here. If we're giving incentives to landlords to be landlords, then their price of entry into the Great Australian Ponzi scheme of real estate should be that they are required to make that solar available to their renters, at a reasonable price. So I think we have to face up to doing it in policy.
Thank you.
Sorry, if I can. You may not ask the question I want you to ask, but that one's near enough. The last one, sorry. I didn't emphasise this enough during my talk. The top 5% of Australian households by income are already doing this, and they're already saving a shit ton of money, and they're driving Teslas, and they're really smug. The next 10 to 20% of Australian households after that, they can pay cash, those 5%, to electrify their whole life. Or the joke I like to tell is if you bought a Range Rover last year, the top shelf Range Rover is $246,000. You could have bought a $46,000 Hyundai Kona electric. With the spare change, you could have put a giant solar system on your house and electrified the kitchen with a really expensive induction stove that makes everyone in the house happy, and electrify the water heater, and etc., and you'd still have $150,000 left to send both kids to private school. And so that electrification pathway is easy for those households. The next 20% of households, let's ambitiously call them the middle class, can probably do this financed against their mortgage, and we have instruments and banks are starting to provide loans. The next 20% will be very uncertain that they want to take out loans to finance this. Even if they're going to save the money, it's very difficult to take on extra debt. And honestly, for the bottom 50% of Australian households, they're excluded from this picture for a long time because the first few slides of my talk were meant to demonstrate very clearly that the shift away from fossil fuels is the shift from fuels to finance. And the only way you get to participate is if you have access to finance. And half of Australian households won't have the credit history, or they won't have a piece of property to do it against. So the huge flaw in the American Inflation Reduction Act was it was a regressive piece of politics because it was only tax code based. So you had to afford enough to pay enough tax to actually get access to those benefits. That's why my house in San Francisco, I got $35,000 worth of benefits because I earn a lot of money, but the average American household will only get $14,000. This is to say the existential risk for climate action in Australia is we don't figure out how to do this through policy, through tax code, through everything for all the demographics of Australia. Otherwise, there'll be the culture wars of last decade will be nothing compared to the culture war when the rich half are driving around and enjoying the benefits. So I really want to emphasise we need policy fixes at the federal level that follow all the way down through to local level that address the renter, the fixed income, all of the people who are struggling in the economy. Sorry.
I was going to say, I'm under strict instructions to get you all off to lunch, but you have been waiting patiently. If you could do it in 20 seconds.
Thank you very much. I'd like you to make a comment on the export part of emissions. You want us to install massive amounts of solar, wind, batteries, etc. You'll be pleased to know my newly renovated home has all electric appliances, rooftop solar and a battery at my own expense, not at the government's expense. But on the other hand, you're more than happy for us to export coal, iron ore and rare earth metals for all of these components, or the large amount of these components, to be manufactured overseas. In some cases, allegedly by slave labour, and by countries who don't have emissions targets, not to mention, or as you did mention, the amount of energy that's used to transport ships all around the world. Then there's the current non-existent end-of-life and recycling industries in Australia. What is your solution to the rebuilding of domestic manufacturing economies to enable these ambitious targets to be met?
It's a great question, and I wrote half a book on this topic, so for a longer answer than I can give you now, a lot of that's in the big switch. I don't think it's likely that we will end up making the heat pumps and the electric vehicles here. That said, we are the first, second, third or fourth largest producer and ore bodies in the world for the top 10 metals that you need for this energy transition, whether that be bauxite, iron ore. And I'm a metallurgist. My first job was in a blast furnace, so I get this, and this is the Australian economy. But we absolutely should be providing the world with the nickel, the copper, the lithium, the steel, the aluminium. To put it in context, we earn about $100 billion a year for fossil fuels today in exports. We only earn a small percentage of that as profit margin. So we probably earn less than the from all the sale of coal and natural gas, we probably earn less than we do, than we pay $40 billion a year for oil. So the current fossil fuel export economy that we tout as being excellent, not only is it mostly foreign owned, mostly doesn't net out above zero because we buy all of our oil. That's to give you enough context to understand that if we merely processed Australian iron ore into iron, that would be $1 trillion export industry. We export 99% of our iron as dirt. So I'd love us to make cars, I'd love us to make all the bits. If all we can do is do the metallurgy that we used to do, I was trained by this, BHP paid for my university degree, we used to do that type of thing. If all we could do was make metals in Australia, we will dwarf our current export potential, and this is an extraordinary, not only is this an extraordinary economic outlook for the Australian household, the story I just told you, the other side of this, and I disagree a little bit with Alan Finkel because he thinks we're going to sell hydrogen to someone, but the reality is if we go big and go hard on metals, doing a better job of it than the rest of the world, we will do extremely well.